For nearly 2,000 years, one image has dominated the imagination of the world. A face with pale skin, soft features, European eyes, flowing light-colored hair, painted on cathedral ceilings, carved into stained glass, printed inside family Bibles, carried across continents by missionaries, empires, artists, and kings. For many, this image became more than tradition. It became reality. But what if the most recognized face in human history was never meant to be a historical portrait? What if the world inherited an image shaped not only by faith, but by culture, power, empire, and time? Because Jesus of Nazareth was not born in Europe. He was born in the ancient Middle East, in a land occupied by Rome, a land connected to Africa, Asia, and the ancient Semitic world, a world of desert winds, dark olive skin weathered by the sun, trade routes stretching into Egypt and Ethiopia, Roman soldiers walking narrow stone streets, refugees, oppression, exile, survival. This was the world of Jesus. So how did the image change? Why do ancient depictions of biblical people look so different from the images many grew up seeing? Why does Africa appear so often in the biblical story? Why did Christianity flourish there long before much of Europe embraced it? And why have suffering and displaced people across history seen themselves reflected in the story of Israel and Christ? This is not a story about replacing one racial narrative with another. It is a journey into history, into memory, into forgotten worlds, and into one question that still echoes across civilizations. Have we misunderstood the face of the ancient world tonight? We follow the evidence, the geography, the art, the history, and the stories buried beneath centuries of tradition. Because sometimes, history does not disappear. Sometimes, it is repainted. Before archaeology, before forensic reconstructions, before historical documentaries and digital analysis, there was the image that billions came to recognize instantly. A European-looking Jesus. For centuries, this became the dominant, visual identity of Christ across the Western world. But where did this image actually come from? Was it preserved from eyewitnesses, ancient descriptions, lost Roman records? Surprisingly, the Bible itself gives almost no physical description of Jesus. The New Testament tells us about his teachings, his miracles, his suffering, his crucifixion, but almost nothing about his physical appearance. No eye color, no skin tone, no height, no detailed facial description. And yet somehow, the modern world inherited a very specific face. The answer lies not only in religion, but in art. As Christianity spread through different civilizations, artists naturally portrayed biblical figures through the lens of their own cultures. In Europe, Jesus slowly began to resemble Europe. Painters during the Byzantine and Renaissance eras depicted Christ with European facial structures, lighter skin, and features familiar to their societies. These images filled churches, manuscripts, paintings, sculptures, and eventually the global imagination itself. Over time, art became memory, and memory became assumed history. But outside Europe, a very different story was unfolding. In Ethiopia, ancient Christian art portrayed Jesus with African features. In parts of Asia, Christ appeared with Eastern characteristics. Across cultures, people often painted sacred figures in ways that reflected themselves, not necessarily to deceive, but to connect. Yet as European influence expanded through colonization and missionary movements, one image spread farther than all the others. The European Jesus became global. For many people today, separating that image from historical reality can feel deeply uncomfortable because the image is emotionally powerful, familiar, sacred. But history asks difficult questions. Jesus was born in Judea. Middle Eastern land under Roman occupation, not medieval France, not Renaissance Italy, not Victorian England. So what would a first-century Jewish man from the ancient Middle East most likely have looked like? To answer that question, we must leave behind paintings and enter the world of ancient Israel itself. The world Jesus was born into did not look like the paintings many people recognize today. It was not the cold stone castles of medieval Europe, not the polished cathedrals of the Renaissance, not the pale courts of kings and emperors. The land of Jesus was ancient Judea, a sun-scorched region at the crossroads of Africa, Asia, and the Mediterranean world. A land filled with traders, soldiers, fishermen, shepherds, refugees, priests, rebels, and travelers from distant nations. This was not an isolated world. It was connected to Egypt, connected to Syria, connected to Arabia, connected to Africa. The ancient roads of the Roman Empire carried languages, cultures, religions, spices, weapons, and people across enormous distances. And among these people lived the Jews of the first century, the descendants of ancient Israel, a Semitic people indigenous to the Levant region of the Middle East. They lived under Roman occupation, taxed heavily, watched, constantly, surrounded by political tension and military power. Every street in Jerusalem carried the shadow of Rome. Every generation carried the memory of exile. The people remembered Babylon, remembered slavery in Egypt, remembered conquest, remembered displacement. This atmosphere shaped the world. Jesus walked through. The climate itself tells part of the story. The intense Middle Eastern sun, the desert winds, the dry terrain, the outdoor labor. People worked under harsh conditions. Farmers, builders, fishermen, stone workers. The average Judean man of the first century would not likely resemble the royal portraits painted centuries later in Europe. Modern forensic studies based on ancient Semitic populations suggest darker hair, brown eyes, olive to darker skin tones, shorter stature, and rugged facial features shaped by climate and labor, not because of ideology, not because of politics, but because geography leaves marks on human history, and history leaves marks on the human face. Yet the deeper question may not simply be, what color was Jesus? The deeper question is, why do so many modern people imagine biblical history through a European lens at all? Because the Bible did not emerge from medieval Europe. It emerged from the ancient Middle East, a region where civilizations collided for thousands of years. Egyptians, Babylonians, Assyrians, Persians, Greeks, Romans, Arabs, Jews, Africans, nomadic tribes, merchants, from distant lands. This was the world surrounding Jesus, a world far more diverse, connected, and complex than many modern portrayals suggest. And perhaps that changes more than just the image. Perhaps it changes how we read the story itself. Because once the ancient world becomes real again, the Bible no longer feels distant. The dust, the heat, the oppression, the survival. It all becomes human, and suddenly, the face history forgot begins to emerge from the shadows. For many people, the ancient world exists only as paintings, distant, softened, almost mythical. But the people of the Bible were not floating figures trapped inside stained glass windows. They were real human beings. They lived beneath brutal sunlight, walked through dust-filled roads, worked with their hands, fled from war, buried their dead, raised children, carried scars, survived empires. Ancient Israel was not Europe. It belonged to the Levant, a region connecting Africa, Arabia, Mesopotamia, and the Mediterranean world. For thousands of years, waves of civilizations crossed these lands: Egyptians, Canaanites, Assyrians, Babylonians, Persians, Greeks, Romans, and in the middle of these crossroads lived the Hebrews, a Semitic people shaped by geography, migration, climate, conquest, and survival. Modern racial categories did not exist yet. People were identified by tribe, language, kingdom, ancestry, religion, empire, not by modern concepts of white or black. Those categories would emerge much later in history, and yet today, many people unconsciously project modern racial ideas backward onto the ancient world. But the ancient Middle East was far more complex. Ancient Jewish populations shared genetic and cultural connections with surrounding Semitic peoples of the Levant region. They likely carried a wide range of brown and olive skin tones shaped by generations under Middle Eastern and Mediterranean climates. The Bible itself reflects this. Environment constantly. Deserts olive trees, harsh sun sandstone. Hills. Dry wilderness, agricultural labor. These were outdoor civilizations. The ancient Israelites did not live inside the pale climates of northern Europe. They lived beneath intense sunlight, generation after generation. And while skin tone alone cannot define identity, geography leaves traces on populations over time. Even ancient Egyptian paintings and regional artwork depict nearby peoples with darker complexions than the later European images many recognize today. The deeper issue may not be whether Jesus was black or white. The deeper issue is that modern audiences often imagine biblical people through centuries of European artistic tradition instead of ancient historical reality. And once that realization begins, something changes. The Bible stops feeling like a European medieval story. It becomes ancient again, Middle Eastern again, dusty, political, dangerous, human. The prophets no longer feel like distant paintings. They become survivors moving through collapsing kingdoms and violent empires. And perhaps that is why these stories continue to resonate with suffering people across the world. Because the story of Israel was never born from comfort. It was born from struggle, from exile, from oppression, from wandering, from survival, and in many ways, that forgotten world still echoes today. For many people today, the biblical world feels separated from Africa. But the ancient Bible tells a very different story. Africa was never distant from the story of Israel. It was woven into it from the beginning, long before modern borders existed. The ancient world was deeply connected through trade routes, migration, war, diplomacy, and empire. And among the most powerful civilizations surrounding Israel stood Egypt, a land the Bible mentions more than almost any other nation. It was in Egypt that Abraham sought refuge during famine. In Egypt that Joseph rose to power. In Egypt that the Israelites multiplied into a great people. And in Egypt that slavery and liberation became central to the biblical memory itself. The Exodus story, one of the most influential narratives in human history, was born on African soil. For generations, the memory of Egypt shaped the identity of Israel, the language, the trauma, the laws, the longing for freedom. Even after the Exodus, Africa remained deeply connected to the biblical world. The Bible repeatedly mentions Cush, an ancient kingdom associated with regions south of Egypt, often connected to Nubia and areas near modern Sudan and Ethiopia. Cushite peoples appear throughout biblical history: warriors, officials, travelers, servants in royal courts. One of the most striking moments comes centuries later in the New Testament. High-ranking Ethiopian official travels to Jerusalem seeking God. On a desert road, he encounters Philip, and there, far from Rome, far from Europe, one of the earliest recorded Christian conversions unfolds involving a man from Africa. This moment mattered deeply to early African Christianity, because Christianity did not arrive in Africa centuries later through colonization alone. It existed, there near the beginning. Long before medieval Europe reached its height, Christian communities already existed across parts of Africa and the Middle East. In Alexandria, Egypt, Christian scholars shaped theology that would influence the world. Ethiopia, ancient Christian traditions survived for centuries, and while Europe would later dominate Christian art and imagery, Africa had already become part of the Christian story long before that dominance emerged. This changes the mental map many people carry about biblical history, because the Bible was never isolated inside Europe. Its world stretched across deserts, kingdoms, coastlines, and continents connected through ancient civilizations. And perhaps nowhere is this more visible than in the story of Jesus himself. According to the Gospel of Matthew, after the birth of Jesus, Mary and Joseph fled into Egypt. The Son of God became a refugee on African soil. Not symbolically, historically. The Holy Family crossed borders seeking survival from political violence. That detail alone reshapes the emotional landscape of the biblical story. The Bible is not a story disconnected from suffering nations and displaced peoples. It is filled with them. Empires rise, empires crush, families flee, kingdoms fall, people wander, and through it all, Africa remains present in the background of Scripture, more than many modern readers realize, not as a footnote, but as part of the ancient world that shaped the Bible itself. Long before modern nations existed, the people of Israel understood something that would shape their identity forever. Loss of freedom, loss of homeland, loss of security. Again and again, the biblical story returns to the same painful cycle. Empire rises. Conquest follows. People are scattered. The story of Israel is not merely the story of kings and prophets. It is the story of a people repeatedly pushed to the edge of survival. First came Egypt, generations living beneath oppression. Forced labor beneath imperial power. Children born into bondage. Then came exile. The Assyrians swept through the north. The Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem. The temple burned. Families were marched away from their homeland. Ancient Israel became a displaced people. And yet, the exile did not erase them. It transformed them. Songs of grief became prayers. Memory became identity. Suffering became scripture. The trauma of exile echoed across generations. Even centuries later, during the time of Jesus, the Jewish people still lived beneath foreign domination. Rome controlled the land. Roman soldiers occupied the streets. Roman taxes burdened the poor. The memory of freedom never fully disappeared. Perhaps that is why the story of Israel would later resonate so deeply with oppressed people across the world, especially among enslaved Africans taken across the Atlantic centuries later. Men, women, and children stolen from their homelands, packed into ships, separated. From language, ancestry, and family, a diaspora born through violence, and in the middle of unimaginable suffering, many encountered the Bible, not as conquerors, but as captives. The Exodus story became more than ancient history. It became a mirror. Pharaoh became the symbol of oppression. Moses became the symbol of deliverance. The Promised Land became hope itself. Spiritual. Songs carried these themes across generations. Go down, Moses. Let my people go. The language of Israel's suffering became the language of survival for another oppressed people centuries later. Not because their histories were identical, but because suffering recognizes suffering. Exile recognizes exile. And perhaps that is one reason the Bible continues to resonate so deeply across cultures and civilizations, because at its core, Scripture is filled with displaced people. Abraham leaving homeland, Joseph sold into Egypt, Israel enslaved, Judah exiled to Babylon, the Holy Family fleeing political violence, the early Christians persecuted by empire. The Bible does not emerge from comfort. It emerges from wandering. And maybe that changes how we understand the story itself. Because once we strip away the polished images and distant paintings, the people of Scripture begin to feel startlingly human. Broken, scattered, Searching for hope beneath the shadow of empire and across centuries, millions of suffering people saw themselves reflected in that story. Across centuries and civilizations, one pattern appears again and again. The oppressed keep returning to the Bible, not because life was easy, but because the people inside Scripture understood suffering. The poor understood it, the enslaved understood it, the exiled understood it, the persecuted understood it, and perhaps nowhere is this more visible than in the figure of Jesus himself. Jesus was not born into political power. He entered the world beneath occupation. Rome ruled the land. Soldiers patrolled the streets. Heavy taxes burdened ordinary people. Even his birth took place far from royal comfort. No palace, no army, no throne, just a child born among the overlooked, and almost immediately, violence followed. According to the gospel narrative, political fear forced Mary and Joseph to flee with the infant Jesus into Egypt. The Son of God entered history as a refugee. That detail alone carries enormous emotional weight, because refugees, displaced families, and oppressed communities across history understand what it means to run for survival. Jesus also spent much of his ministry among those society rejected: the sick, the poor, the blind, the grieving, the imprisoned, the outcasts. Again and again, the Gospels place him beside people crushed beneath the weight of society. And this became deeply meaningful for suffering communities throughout history, especially for those denied dignity by empire, slavery, conquest, or oppression. For many enslaved Africans in the Americas, the Bible became more than religion. It became survival. The suffering of Israel felt familiar. The cries beneath Pharaoh felt familiar. Even the crucifixion itself carried emotional power. A man humiliated publicly, beaten by the state, executed by imperial authority, yet somehow transformed into a symbol of hope. This is one reason the image of Jesus spread across so many different cultures. People saw themselves in him, not because every culture agreed on his physical appearance, but because pain recognizes compassion. The wounded recognize mercy, the oppressed recognize liberation. And throughout history, artists painted Jesus in ways that reflected their own communities. In Ethiopia, he appeared with African features. In Europe, he appeared European. In Asia, he appeared Asian. These images reveal something profound about humanity itself. People often imagine the sacred through familiar faces. But beneath all those artistic interpretations remains a deeper historical truth. Jesus came from the ancient Middle East, a land of political violence, empire, trade routes, migration, and survival. A world much closer to the struggles of ordinary humanity than many modern depictions suggest. And perhaps this explains why Christianity spread so powerfully among suffering populations across the world. Because the message at its center was never simply about power. It was about redemption, hope for the broken, justice for the oppressed, mercy for the rejected. And maybe that is why the image of Jesus became universal. Because suffering people everywhere kept finding themselves, reflected in his story. Long before towering cathedrals rose across Europe, before kings marched beneath the banner of Christianity, before Renaissance painters transformed the image of Jesus, there were already ancient Christian communities thriving in Africa, and among the most remarkable of them stood Ethiopia, a civilization deeply connected to the ancient biblical world. To many modern audiences, Ethiopia appears distant from biblical history, but in the ancient world it was known. Trade routes connected the Horn of Africa to Egypt, Arabia, Jerusalem, and beyond. Merchants crossed deserts carrying gold, incense, ivory, spices, manuscripts, and ideas between continents. The Bible itself mentions Ethiopia repeatedly. Ancient writers often referred to regions south of Egypt as Cush or Ethiopia. These lands were not invisible to the biblical imagination. They were part of the world surrounding Israel. And according to the book of Acts, one of the earliest recorded African followers of Christianity was an Ethiopian official traveling from Jerusalem. That moment would echo across centuries, because Christianity in Africa was not a late invention. It was ancient, very ancient. By the 4th century, the kingdom of Aksum in Ethiopia had embraced Christianity officially. This happened while much of Europe was still divided between pagan traditions and emerging Christian influence. Ancient Ethiopian believers preserved scriptures, liturgies, sacred art, fasting traditions, and forms of worship that survived for centuries and hidden among mountains and stone cliffs. They built churches unlike almost anything else in the world. Massive structures carved directly into rock, sanctuaries cut downward into the earth itself, places where candlelight illuminated ancient prayers, while empires rose and collapsed beyond their walls. Inside these churches, Jesus was often portrayed with African and Ethiopian features, not necessarily because Ethiopians claimed Jesus was ethnically Ethiopian, but because throughout history, cultures often portrayed sacred figures through familiar human faces. Europe did the same, Asia did the same. Human beings naturally imagine holiness through the visual language they know best. Yet something extraordinary happened over time. As European colonial influence expanded across continents, European Christian imagery became globally dominant. For millions of people, the Western image of Jesus slowly replaced older local artistic traditions, and many ancient Christian histories outside Europe faded from mainstream awareness. But Ethiopia remained. Ancient manuscripts survived there. Ancient liturgies survived there. Ancient Christianity survived there. Even today, some Ethiopian traditions preserve languages and practices connected to worlds astonishingly close to antiquity. This forces modern audiences to reconsider a forgotten truth. Christianity was never born in Europe. It emerged from the Middle East. It spread through Africa. It traveled across deserts and trade routes long before it became associated primarily with the West. And perhaps that realization changes more than history. Perhaps it changes imagination itself. Because once the ancient church becomes visible again, the story of Christianity begins to feel far larger than many people were taught to believe. History does not only survive through books, it survives through images, paintings, statues, icons, murals, cathedrals, symbols repeated generation after generation until memory itself begins to change. And perhaps no image in human history became more recognizable than the face of Jesus. But here is the question that quietly lingers beneath centuries of tradition. Did art slowly reshape how the world imagined biblical history? Because the earliest followers of Jesus left behind no universally accepted portrait, no preserved Roman sketch, no verified painting from eyewitnesses, no official physical description recorded in Scripture. The image would come later. As Christianity spread across nations and empires, artists began portraying biblical figures through the visual language of their own cultures. And slowly, the face evolved. In the Byzantine world, Christ took on imperial symbolism. In medieval Europe, painters reflected European society around them. During the Renaissance, artists elevated biblical scenes with familiar European features, architecture, and beauty standards. Over centuries, these images became dominant, not only inside churches, but inside the imagination of entire civilizations. For millions of people, these paintings no longer felt symbolic. They felt historical. But art is rarely neutral. Artists paint through the lens of culture, politics, theology, and power. And as European empires expanded across continents, European religious imagery traveled with them. Missionaries carried paintings, colonial churches displayed European icons, Bibles printed European illustrations. Gradually, one visual tradition overshadowed many others: ancient African depictions, Middle Eastern imagery, Eastern Christian iconography. Much of it faded into the background of global memory, and yet traces survived. In Ethiopian churches, Jesus still appeared, with African features. In ancient Middle Eastern Christian communities, biblical figures often resembled the surrounding populations. Across Asia, local artistic traditions portrayed Christ through familiar faces. This reveals something profoundly human. People often imagine sacred history through themselves, not necessarily out of deception, but out of connection. And perhaps this is where modern debates become complicated, because many people are not only defending historical ideas, they are defending emotional inheritance. The image they grew up with, the image that comforted them, the image hanging inside churches, homes, and childhood memories. Questioning that image can feel personal, but history continues asking difficult questions. What did first-century Judeans likely look like? What happens when European artistic tradition becomes mistaken for ancient historical reality? And how much of what modern audiences imagine about biblical history was shaped by later empires rather than the ancient world itself? These questions do not necessarily erase faith. If anything, they may bring the biblical world closer to reality, because once the layers of centuries are pulled back, the Bible no longer feels trapped inside Renaissance Europe. It returns to deserts, stone villages, trade routes, occupied lands, brown-skinned Semitic peoples beneath, Middle Eastern sunlight. The ancient world breathes again, and perhaps that is what unsettles people most. Not the possibility that history was hidden, but the realization that history may have been slowly repainted in plain sight for centuries. What if this entire conversation has been asking the wrong question? Because maybe the deepest mystery was never, was Jesus white? Maybe the real question is far more unsettling. Why does humanity seem determined to recreate God in its own image? That pattern appears everywhere, every civilization, every empire, every culture. Kings imagined heaven looking like their kingdoms. Artists painted holiness through familiar faces. Empires projected themselves into sacred history. And over centuries, those images became emotional truth. But something strange happens when we return to the ancient world itself. The illusion begins to crack. The Bible suddenly feels less European, less polished, less distant, and far more human. Its people lived under occupation, faced displacement, escaped violence, survived conquest. These were not untouchable figures floating through golden paintings. They were vulnerable people moving through dangerous empires, and perhaps that changes the emotional meaning of Scripture completely. Because the Bible does not emerge from comfort. It emerges from survival, which may explain why oppressed people throughout history kept recognizing themselves inside its pages. But here is where the mystery deepens. If every culture reshaped sacred imagery through familiar faces, then perhaps the modern world inherited something far more powerful than a painting. It inherited psychological ownership. And once an image becomes tied to identity, challenging it can feel like a personal attack. That is why these conversations become so emotional. Not because everyone agrees on history, but because memory itself is involved. Childhood, faith, family, tradition, culture. The image became personal, yet ancient history keeps whispering the same uncomfortable reminder. Jesus was born in the Middle East among Semitic people, inside a world connected to Africa, Asia, and the ancient Mediterranean. Not inside Renaissance Europe. And the deeper archaeology, geography, and historical reconstruction move backward in time. The more unfamiliar the modern inherited image begins to feel. But before we jump to another simplistic conclusion, another danger appears. Because history can also be manipulated in the opposite direction. One distortion can easily be replaced by another. And perhaps that is the trap humanity repeatedly falls into, turning sacred history into modern tribal identity, reducing ancient people into modern political categories they never knew. The ancient world was more complicated than that, more connected, more fluid, more human, which leads to a final possibility many people never consider. Maybe the power of Jesus was never meant to come from looking like one group of people. Maybe the reason billions connected to him across continents is because suffering itself recognized something familiar in his story. The refugee, the oppressed, the rejected, the wounded, the poor, the conquered, and perhaps every civilization that encountered him, slowly painted pieces of itself into his face. Not always out of deception, sometimes out of longing, sometimes out of hope. Sometimes because human beings desperately want heaven to look familiar. But the deeper we travel into ancient history, the harder it becomes to ignore one final reality. The biblical world was never as visually simple as modern imagination made it seem. And maybe that forgotten complexity changes everything. After all the debates, all the paintings, all the arguments about skin color, empire, identity, and history, perhaps one truth rises above them all. There is only one Jesus. Not the Jesus trapped inside Renaissance paintings. Not the Jesus shaped by empire. Not the Jesus recreated by politics, and not the Jesus limited to one nation, one ethnicity, or one civilization. The real Jesus walked the earth long before cameras existed, long before cathedrals rose, long before artists painted his face. And maybe that was never the most important thing about him, because the power of Jesus was never in a portrait. It was in his message: hope for the broken, mercy for the guilty, justice for the oppressed, love stronger than hatred, light stronger than darkness. Across history, human beings painted him differently because humanity longs to see itself in the sacred. And perhaps every culture carried part of that longing. But no painting fully contains him. No empire owns him. No race controls him. The Jesus of history stepped into a world filled with suffering, division, violence, fear, and empire. And according to the scriptures, he is coming again, not for one tribe, not for one color, not for one nation, but for people from every nation, every language, every background. Across all of history, kings and servants, rich and poor, forgotten and known. And maybe that is the final mystery hidden beneath this entire journey. Humanity kept arguing over the image, while the message was always bigger than the image. Because, in the end, salvation was never about looking like Jesus. It was about following him. And somewhere beyond all the paintings, beyond all the debates, beyond centuries of human imagination, the real Christ remains, not silent, not absent, but alive. And one day, every nation will see him.